Okay, good morning everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Dr. Olivia Wilkinson and I am the Director of Research at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. Welcome to our second webinar in our series on faith and climate. Our second webinar, as you can see on the slide here, is about interfaith climate initiatives. We'll be hearing from a range of very interesting speakers today. We've got 3 speakers and then there'll be time for question and answers later on. I'm going to initially just hand over to Stacey Nam, our knowledge manager, who can explain a little bit more about the technical features on Zoom and the way that we'll be using this platform for the webinar today.
Thanks, Olivia. As you can see, we are recording the webinar, so if you would not like to be recorded, please just keep yourself muted. Other than that, if you move your mouse around the screen, you'll see a bar pop up on the bottom that's black, and you'll see a chat box that's the kind of word bubble. So feel free at any point to send us any questions you may have. Also, you can kind of raise your hand or tell us whether or not you're having some technical difficulties and can't hear the speakers. So thanks for joining. And if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, please go ahead and do so.
Thanks, Stacey. So yes, it would be really great if you could just now take some time to respond to everyone in the chat, introduce your name and your organization that you're coming from or your interest in this topic. Okay, so our agenda today, we have started this series on faith and climate due to a rising interest from our members at the Joint Learning Initiative in the topic of climate, broadly put. Over the course of the webinar series, we're having a range of different debates coming from different angles on the topic. So the first webinar, and you can find the recording online at our website, jliflc.com. It's if you scroll down on the front page of the website, you can find the link there. Our first webinar was on faith-based practical examples of the work with faith communities and of faith communities around climate. The second webinar we have today is on interfaith initiatives. So we're recognizing that there's a lot of work within the work of faith communities on climate to work across different faith traditions and understand how we can build interfaith initiatives around climate. So I'm going to start today with a presentation from Leo D, who's from the Interfaith Center on Sustainability, who's based in Jerusalem. We will then also hear from Fletcher Harper of GreenFaith and Dr. Iyad Abumoghli from the UN. So yes, sorry, Stacey, I'm going back and forth between those slides. You can go to the next slide now. Thank you. So Leo D, if you can unmute now, I see that you are. So Leo, as you can see here, is the project coordinator for ecotourism and eco-Bible commentary at the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. And we'll hear from Leo and each of the speakers for roughly 10 minutes. And then we'll have lots of time for question and answers at the end. So I do encourage you again to add any questions that you may have to the group chat during the course of Leo's presentation. And we will be collecting the questions at the end, and then I'll be putting the questions back to our speakers at the end. So please add any thoughts you may have to the chat. Okay, Leo, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much to Olivia and Stacey for inviting us to speak today, and to JLI, and really congratulations on this initiative. Very quick introduction to the the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development and myself. Very quickly, the organization was set up by our founder, Rabbi Yonatan Nerel, a while back, because he saw that governments and corporations were failing to solve the climate issues. And he figured out that actually the people who were going to solve it were going to be people like you and me, the average person, most of whom in the world are religious, affiliated to some religious organization, faith, and therefore by training and working with religious leaders, we hope that we can help spread the message of sustainability, which will help impact the world from bottom up. My personal background, very quickly, I'm a rabbi as well, but I worked in sustainable investment before coming to the Interfaith Center. So I have sort of a number of different hats on, and you'll probably see some of those coming out in this little presentation. So please, with that, if we can move on to the first slide. I wanted to set an optimistic setting for this discussion, because a lot of sustainable climate change discussions focus on the negative, and I think we all know what those are and the risks, and clearly we do face a very critical time in our generation and the next generation, so that is for sure. However, we often don't give enough credit to the good things that are happening already, and there are not enough of them. However, the platform for a lot of the things that need to be done exists. And I guess as religious people, one would want to work within the frameworks that exist and not have to reinvent the wheel. So this presentation is really to talk about what's going on at the moment and how one perhaps can think about this in terms of one's own community, one's own area or domain. And effectively, there are three levels of interfaith sustainability that are happening at the moment. There's the micro level. We all know of little projects happening locally to us, maybe by the church or by the mosque or by the synagogue or other religious organizations, or I would even put into that non-religious organizations, which are sort of community groups. There are many different micro, local level initiatives that are bringing people together as communities to help with the climate. Then there are the macro things that are happening at a country level. Clearly, you know, the Paris Agreement was something that was at a macro level and involved to a certain extent religious leaders, and we see religious leaders now increasingly invited to United Nations events on the climate. So that's very positive. And in the middle is something which I've called the meso level, which is sort of commercial level. And I want to show you how religions can work with companies to make changes to the environment for the good. So maybe we'll start, please, with the first thing, which is the local level. Just a little example of a project that we run in Jerusalem. We've run successfully in the past. We're looking to run it again later this year or next year, which is typical perhaps of the type of projects I talked about before, the sort of community level projects that can happen at a religious level to impact the environment and to educate about sustainability. So our project that we love is what we call the Jerusalem Women Educators Sustainability Project. And effectively, what this does is unites women teachers in schools around Jerusalem. And because of where we are, we have Christian, Muslim, and Jewish teachers in different schools around Jerusalem. And we bring them together in workshops and explain to them how to build a vertical garden in their classroom, which effectively is a wall of plants that can be watered with some sort of simple drip irrigation system, which fortunately nowadays can be purchased for a very small amount of money. We talk about how one would set that up in the classroom. We give them the equipment. We follow them through the process. They educate. We come into the classroom to help explain to the kids what's going on. And we support them throughout the whole project. And not only does it bring together the sort of interfaith aspect of the different religion, the women teachers, it also teaches sustainability to them and also to all the kids that they touch as well. So it's, from our perspective, a beautiful project that has elements of interfaith, sustainability, education, and spreads the word across a wide expanse of people. So that's on a micro level, the type of project that we do, but obviously all of you can think of other projects which are happening in your local areas, often run by local communities of one sort or another. If we can move on, please, to the next slide. what I've called the meso level, a commercial level example, we have a beautiful project. We work closely with a company called Gigawatt Global, which is an Israeli-based corporation that actually is building solar panel projects in Africa. They recently completed an 8.5 megawatt project in Rwanda, which now supplies 6% of the total electricity in Rwanda, and is the first solar power project in that country. It's a $24 million field, and we work with Gigawatt that implements such projects in order to build these type of fields on Anglican community grounds in East Africa. So at the moment we're in very close discussions about building such large multi-megawatt solar fields in the land of Anglican communities in Malawi and Mozambique. And not only is it a benefit to the corporate of working with a religious community, because there's we found there's no corruption amongst those particular bishops that we're working with. They're wonderful people with great hearts, and they really want these projects to succeed, and they're trying to open every door for us to make this happen. So not only from that perspective, also they benefit because having the solar power actually in their grounds means that we can actually give them free or discounted electricity to their churches and their schools and their hospitals and so forth. So it's a win-win, and it shows actually how religious communities can really work well in this particular domain of sustainability, because they can be trusted. They have the similar aims. Interesting thing being in the Interfaith Center is that if you look at our website, which is interfaithsustain.com, we have a beautiful page of about 20 different religions and their views on sustainability. And whilst interfaith, topics, we can argue, every religion can argue with every other religion on pretty much any topic. Funnily enough, the one topic that seems to be everybody has to be in agreement is this issue of sustainability, because every religion seems to obviously values the importance of mankind living on this planet, and the next generation and future generations being able to live here as well. So it's a beautiful way that we work with religious communities building sustainable projects in their land, and that's a commercial level, meso level example. The next example, please. I won't say too much, but Israel obviously is the Jewish country, and therefore you might say I'm stretching this by saying that this is a sort of Jewish project, but one thing that Israelis had to do from about 80 years ago, before the state was actually founded, was to try and work out how to create more water, drinking water, because there really wasn't enough water at the time, 80 years ago, for the number of people that were going to live in this land. And so a huge amount of effort and investment has been put into developing an amazing water system with desalination plants, with about 90% of all water recycled, used for agricultural use. The next best country in the world, I think, is Spain with 23% and America with 3%. So Israel has some techniques which are valuable to the world, and is training hundreds of thousands of people from different countries in how to do this and rolling this technology out across the world. The picture there of Bibi Netanyahu with Modi, the President of India, just wanted to bring it in there because he came a couple of years ago to visit. And the picture that everyone remembers was him standing in the sea, because really the reason he came was for Israeli water technology, and that was the purpose of that visit. So countries can also play a big part in this, and there is a sort of interfaith religious aspect as well to that. I want to prove that, although I'm sure that will raise more questions than it will answer, with the next slide, and then I will conclude. So the next slide, please. Unfortunately, I didn't have any better data than this for you today, but maybe other people do, and I'm sure you'll ask me questions about this. But I came across this Mori poll where they interviewed engineers in Britain, France, and Germany, and they found that half of them were religious and half of them were non-religious or anti-religious, which is perhaps different to what we normally think of. We normally consider religion versus science. And this was just a very comforting survey that shows that actually the situation is not quite as dire as we think, that a lot of scientists are actually religious. And certainly that plays out in my own experience. I'm a scientist, I'm also religious, but I also know many other people in a similar sense. I know this doesn't say what the average is in each of these countries, but I'm sure this percentage is higher than average. And it also doesn't tell me what I really want to know, which is what percentage of religious engineers work in sustainable technology development, because I think that's the interesting aspect here. But I would imagine that there are probably a higher percentage of religious people in sustainable technology development. And so therefore, the potential here is great. If we can, religious communities can communicate the urgency and the importance of the religious nature of the sustainability crisis, then people are out there already working in science and technology, working on solutions. And it wouldn't take a lot for them to be inspired to go off and do startups to try and build companies that can deal with this. And so, you know, the religious world stands here at a point where it can have a massive impact on the climate on the planet going forwards. And it's a question, I think, mostly, in our opinion, of awareness. People have to realize this is a religious issue. Every religion agrees that this is something which is critical, that the world should be sustainable, that we should be able to pass something on to future generations. And as you've seen, hopefully, there is hope here, even though a huge amount more could be done and should be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Leo. That was something to get us thinking, a good open question at the end about how we can consider the role of religious scientists working in this area. So hopefully there'll be a few questions coming from the group, and we can discuss a little bit more about these intersections and how it also might work across micro, meso and macro levels, and thinking about the ways that different interfaith projects work at those different levels. So now I'm going to pass over to Fletcher Harper. So if you can unmute Fletcher, then we'll be able to hear from you. Fletcher Harper is the Executive Director of GreenFaith, and I will leave it to him to explain a little bit more about GreenFaith, because I know that you're going to do that in your presentation. So over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Good, wonderful to be together. What I'm going to do is talk about the work that GreenFaith does with a very specific focus on the role and the dimension that the interfaith aspect of what we do is relevant. And you can see our mission statement here on the screen. What I would say in an effort both to stir the pot and also to reflect our experience is that when it comes to religious action on the environment, that interfaith organizations and interfaith work plays a singular and irreplaceable role, partly because there's a specialization and a development of subject matter expertise that individual religious communities are not necessary, that individual denominations or traditions have not to date found it easy to develop for a number of reasons. A second piece, which I think is really fundamentally important about interfaith work, is that really doing what we need to do to protect the environment represents or challenges us to cross a lot of thresholds, to work in ways that we're not accustomed to working, to work on topics that we're not accustomed to working, and to working with people that we're not accustomed to working with. And we have found that for religious institutions, when they go from working just within their own individual parish or mosque or temple or congregation, and they start working in an interfaith manner, it signifies and represents that kind of threshold crossing behavior, which absolutely has to become a norm if we are to have any hope of making change at the level that's required. So we'll go to the next slide. And we view more and more our work as being framed on getting religious communities and offering them the opportunity to cross those thresholds and to put their beliefs into action for the environment. We focus our work on an interfaith level in three different areas. We do a lot of training and capacity building work. We do quite a lot of activist campaigning and mobilizing and advocacy work. And increasingly in the last 2 years, we've started to pivot towards multi-faith organizing on a local level, because we believe that the local level is where an awful lot of the development of this movement needs to happen. And if you go on to the next slide, I'll take just a couple of minutes to talk about the core values we find, and there are different words that different traditions use, but you can click once and see that there's a spirit dimension, which religions and spiritualities around the world resonate with in terms of a core value around this. If you click the next slide, stewardship or sustainability is about the theme of consumption habits. There's a lot of difference between the world's religions, but none of them says that the purpose of life is to consume as much as you possibly can. So there's this idea about mindfulness or care around the way we consume. And then the final click on this is the theme of equity or of justice, or of that term takes on different connotations in different cultures. But the idea is that all people and all forms of life really deserve and need to have a safe and healthy environment, and recognizing that ethnic and religious minorities, the poor, wherever they're found around the world, usually it's the most vulnerable communities that suffer the worst. So we find articulating values and then inviting people from different religions to reflect on how those values resonate and can be articulated within their traditions are important. The next slide shows a little bit about one of the ways that we do our education and training work, and it's actually where I am right now. We have a fellowship program that is been in operation now for 11 years. It's an education and leadership training program that consists of retreats and education about local organizing, about environment and climate through an equity lens, focusing on ethnic and gender and economic justice as they relate to the issue of climate change and environmental degradation. We are in the process now of planning for the development of fellowship programs in different regions of the world, with India being the next region where we'll open a fellowship program, because we've found that there are people from a diverse range of religious and spiritual traditions everywhere who want to dive deeply into this topic, who want to form a community of support and of leadership. And that's what the fellowship program has been doing for some time. Again, we find that when people come into community, into interfaith community around this, it represents and triggers a deep inner transformation that is part and parcel of the work that we need to be doing in terms of transitioning to a sustainable future. The next slide shows that we have a similar initiative that works with seminaries, and our good friends at the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development have been a partner in some of this work. And the Green Seminary Initiative is working with a growing network of seminaries, theological schools, theological colleges in different regions, and is trying to provide support for faculty who are trying to help transform those institutions, and also give students within those institutions a place to go to dig deeply into this engagement around religion and climate change, religion and the environment. The next slide shows we have a number of resources that are again promoted and provided with an interfaith perspective, whether they're used in a church or a synagogue or a mosque. They always bring up the interfaith dimension to things. Next slide will show the campaigning and advocating and mobilizing work. This is the work that is absolutely fundamental and vital, and is also, as we know, sometimes more difficult for official religious denominations to get involved in. But we know from experience that the moral and public power of the religious sector must be manifest, and we find that when it comes forward in a multi-faith way, it plays very well with civil society advocates who may be wary of wanting to appear sectarian in terms of their engagement with the religious sector, but who welcome an interfaith approach. So just a couple of areas where we've been very active. The first, where it says divest and shine, we've been working with diverse faith groups around the world to support the fossil fuel divestment movement, and through the Shine campaign, which is a campaign promoting investment in energy access for clean energy access for all people. We've been working with Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian partners to start to build awareness about the fact that there are a billion people who lack access to energy, and that they absolutely must get that access in the form of renewable energy. Climate mobilizations, the photograph that's at the top left is a photo of a wonderful music and prayer, multi-faith 3-hour thing that we were able to organize at the People's Climate March in New York back in 2014. Green New Deal work in the United States is emerging very rapidly as an area of activity, and is starting to resonate on the international level in terms of the need for massive infrastructure investment. And the climate emergency work that has been taking off at the municipal level is, again, something that we're working on with faith groups in an interfaith framework. I think, again, as an interfaith group, we find it very easy both to work with religious groups, but also to work with secular partners. And that's been a helpful framing. And then finally, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which we're involved in with UN Environment, Religions for Peace, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, Parliament of the World Religions, and the World Council of Churches, is an interfaith campaign initiative getting religious groups working with indigenous partners in 5 particular countries: Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, to mobilize religious support for action to protect rainforests. The next slide is a piece on the local organizing work. Compared to 10 years ago, there's tremendous awareness now. We still have a long way to go in terms of the action level, but there is a lot of awareness now at the local level within religious and spiritual communities. And so we're organizing and supporting the organization of GreenFaith circles in a wide range of places around the world. Circles exist now in the US, in parts of Latin America, and in India, and we're preparing a big push for later this year to open that up, because what we know is that we have to have a very, very strong and large base of support for this work. And we know that people at the local level are ready to come into action. And we also know that within any given mosque or temple or church, there are maybe only 2 or 3 or 4 people who really care about, or who are really deeply committed to these issues. Those people need a place to come together so that they can work together and build power and awareness and capacity at that local level. We also find that these circles provide a place to loop in what some refer to as the SBNRs, the spiritual but not religious, which is the fastest growing sort of segment globally in the religious population. So I think that was it. I think if you go to the next slide, I think it's just my contact information. Again, we've found that this sort of interfaith frontier has been, and I think will remain, a really important leading edge of the religious environmental movement, and it's a real joy to be working in it, and we're eager to connect with anybody who's interested in doing more. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Fletcher. And I think that there's a lot to reflect on there. I certainly have a few questions coming up about in my mind, about the specific elements of what makes the interfaith approach different. And we can get to that a little bit more in the question and answer sections next, but particularly elements around the ability to work with secular and spiritual but not religious is something that really stood out to me there. Otherwise, now we will go on to our next speaker. So Iyad, if you can unmute. Oh yes, you're unmuted, very good. And so as you can see on the slide here, Iyad Abumoghli is the Principal Advisor for the on Faith at UN Environment, and I will hand over to you now so you can explain a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon and probably good evening to all of you. And let me start by wishing you the blessings of Ramadan Kareem. And thank you for hosting me to talk today. I will be also brief. I will talk a little bit about the Faith for Earth initiative, why we're doing it, and then what we have been doing. And later on, I will mention what other faith organizations have been doing on the issue of climate change. So the Faith for Earth initiative was established in 2017. So 2 years now into working on engaging with faith-based organizations at the different levels, the global, regional, and local levels. And the reason for establishing this initiative is actually on the second slide, which we have seen globally, and it was mentioned by Leo, that governments alone cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We are falling behind, and we are facing the most disastrous challenge of our times, which is climate change. So we do need an accelerated approach that will take us faster in fighting the impacts of climate change and preventing climate change of being drastically affecting the human lives. Also, whatever has been or is being doing by governments and by organizations and international community is sort of happening at a low level, or initiatives and projects here and there. So we do need to scale up actions, and we do need to streamline the innovative approaches that are being used by some organizations from all walks of life. So it has to become a way of doing things rather than initiatives of a small scale. And all of what we do must be transformative, or transformational. That means we need to change our behaviors and the way we do things. We are in the fourth industrial revolution, which is based on the cybernetics and so on, the availability of internet everywhere. But also it will have to be a revolution of ethics and values. We cannot continue improving our prosperity, our growth, our economic development, and so on the expense of the limited resources of Earth. So we have to be transformational in our approaches, and it has to be ethical, employing the highest ethics and values in doing so. We cannot, increase the GDP of countries while at the same time increase the number of poor people in the same country that has increased its GDP. So there is a wrong, or the equation is not correct. So we need to change that. And then we do need to change the paradigm of investment into impact investment, because we know that trillions of dollars are being invested by organizations, by governments, and so on. But these investments usually lead to one of the pillars of sustainable development rather than being comprehensive in covering the three pillars of economic development, social, and environmental development as well. The next slide is the three overarching goals of the Faith for Earth initiative, which basically builds on the partnership with faith-based organizations and faith leaders at all levels. We do want to provide sort of a platform where all the good work of all these faith-based organizations do talk to one another and do learn from each other. So the impact is maximized, and a more number of people are being impacted by the initiatives that are being done by organizations. We do need to have Pope Francis everywhere and for every faith, and by all faith leaders. We do need to have vocal leaders who talk to their followers with authority, with knowledge, and so on. So we do need to empower faith leaders to be able to talk about climate change and environment in general for that matter. The second goal is what was mentioned briefly by Father Fletcher on faith-based investment. And we know that faith-based organizations are the fourth largest power or economic power on earth. So they deal with trillions of dollars on an annual basis. They build schools, hospitals, roads, they construct houses and so on. So their investment would require to be leading to positive impact. However, the generation of the resources, the financial resources for such organizations comes unfortunately from unsustainable practices. For example, investing in oil and gas. And we have seen recently some actions taken by some churches and the Islamic Development Bank and other Islamic institutions by shifting or divesting from investing in oil and gas. But it is not only the investment, it is the practices of these organizations. We do need to practice what we preach. If we have a mosque or a church or a synagogue or a temple, we do need to have those houses of worship employ sustainability in their own buildings and assets and so on. And the third goal is actually linking the science to environmental issues and faith work. So as was mentioned by Leo, faith and science actually do not contradict one another. And they need to be mutually supportive. For example, UN Environment publishes on annual basis so many publications, but these are scientific publications that can hardly be comprehended or used by faith-based organizations, and let alone faith leaders preaching about the relationship between their religion and the environment. So we do need to make that available in the language that is used by faith-based organizations. And the next slide actually talks about what happened at the UN Environment Assembly, where we had the pleasure and honor of hosting a faith dialogue for 5 days, where 63 speakers came from 56 organizations, and the event was attended by 220 people who came to share their experiences and their stand on environmental issues from a faith perspective. We had 12 faiths represented at the dialogue, and we had beautiful interaction, not only among and between faith leaders, but also between faith leaders and policymakers, which was one of the main objectives for the dialogue. As the UN Environment Assembly is the parliament of the environment of the world, where policymakers from 193 countries gather every 2 years to take decisions and adopt resolutions on environmental matters. So the following slide also shows what we are or what we will be doing at another high-level political forum, which will be held in New York in July, the first week and the second week of July. And we have, with the UN Task Force on Religion and Development, we'll be organizing what we call the Kofi Annan Faith Briefing, and 3 main areas have been selected as the focus: children, gender issues, and climate action. So UN Environment will be organizing the climate action part of it, and a number of the members of the advisory board or advisory council to the task force will be talking about their actions and the interfaith work on climate action. The following slide actually simply tells us what we can, each one of us, do and as faith-based organizations and faith leaders. There are 37 million churches in the world, and there are 3.6 million mosques and 20,000 synagogues and so on. And we have seen some movement into greening those houses of worship. So if we just install one solar panel on the roof of each of these houses of worship, imagine how many millions of solar panels we will be immediately using, and how much thousands of tons of carbon dioxide we will be reducing. One initiative that is already going on in one country, that 100% of mosques have committed and almost have done it, that they all run on renewable sources of energy. So it can be done. There is an example there. Other countries have started adopting it. So we need to accelerate and move on. Of course, there are many other things other than energy, on mobility, on water conservation, and so on. And all of that is impacted by climate change and impacts climate change as well. The last slide I would like to share with you is what it's a compendium of areas of collaboration where faith-based organizations have been active and working. For example, on mobilization and campaigning, we have seen around the COPs, a number of faith-based organizations have been campaigning, have been organizing briefs and meetings and conducting awareness campaigns and so on. On advocacy and awareness, of course, well, this webinar is one of them. But also the work of the World Council of Churches on the sustainable communities, where awareness on climate issues is projected and shared. Working with businesses, again, Leo mentioned that they have been working with businesses, exactly their work in Africa, but also, for example, what I mentioned about the divestment policy, where the Pope have met with business leaders. The Church of England has developed a divestment policy. And of course, we at UN Environment are launching the work between faith and investment institutions. Information sharing, Father Fletcher mentioned their own work on energy conservation and so on. Connecting with religions with science. UNEP as the organization which we call ourselves a science-based organization, which we depend on scientific facts to advocate for environmental protection, but also the National Religious Partnership for Environment. It's an organization that brings leaders or faith leaders with scientists to debate and discuss the relationship between science and religions. One important area is legislations or legislatives, where, as I mentioned, UN Environment Assembly is the house of legislation on environmental issues, but also other faith organizations like the Evangelical Climate Initiative works on pushing and proposing legislative actions by governments. Education, a number of examples like the Religious Witness for the Earth, where they lobby and produce, if you wish, testimonials on the role of faith-based organizations and how faith can contribute to climate action. Resilience and adaptation, where some faith-based organizations like the Catholic Relief Services in the Philippines have been helping women cope with the disastrous impacts of hurricanes and cyclones and what have you, and severe climatic issues, and produce or be able to cope with their families. Capacity building, the Parliament of World Religions have established a climate hub where they conduct seminars and webinars and what have you to build the capacity of interested people. Of course, political declarations are very important, and we have seen from almost all the different faiths, climate change declarations being developed and advocated at the highest levels. And on the ground work on renewable energy projects, the work of the Interfaith Center on Sustainable Development in Africa, but also the work of World Evangelical Alliance as well in Africa on providing sustainable or renewable energy facilities for the local communities. So we see that there are lots of interfaith work on climate action. What we need to do now is scale it up, streamline it, and accelerate it so we would have a greater impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iyad, and incredibly comprehensive overview of everything that's going on there. There is so much work happening already, and we want to recognise that and acknowledge that. Again, you know, the webinar series that we're doing now is a space where we can start the discussion, particularly about what's happened before, but also where perhaps the gaps are in terms of research and evidence. As you may know, that the JLI is particularly interested in this idea of what is the research and evidence that we have and that we need around questions of religion and sustainable development. So now we have time for question and answers. I would encourage you to write your questions in the chat. If you, the chat option has a button in the drop-down menu to write to everyone, so please write them to everyone in that case. We would also encourage, if you want to share any materials that you have, you can do that either by going on the link that Stacey's put in the chat there, jliflc.com/climate, and you can also email that information to us. Otherwise, I think that we would encourage anyone that wants to share their own website or perhaps any further information on the chat to do so as well. Okay, so while I'm waiting for any of your question and answers, please put them in the chat there. I have an initial question. Okay, yes, I have a question from Jean, who's the president of the JLI, and her question is, how would better evidence for faith engagement in climate action strengthen the faith-based activism and advocacy? What are the evidence gaps? So what do we need to know, again, even particularly about interfaith initiatives, what are the research and evidence gaps? I'll go in the order of our speakers, so perhaps Leo, if you would like to answer first.
Sure, I'm glad I presented that last slide because as I say, it created more questions than it answered, but I think to me it flagged up the need for us to find out, you know, in the organizations, apart from the faith-based organizations of our speakers, but in terms of the organizations that are physically out there dealing technologically or in projects to solve some of these climate issues. I think some research that shows the level of religiosity of the management, of the engineers, of those teams, the religious motivations, perhaps, if they exist, of those people, would be an incredible piece of work, because I think, you know, it would give a lot of, you know, if, as I assume it would come up with some interesting insights into a religious participation in those type of roles, it would give a lot of motivation, I think, to other people. And it would tell a story, which we can't tell at the moment because we don't really have that data to know to what extent religious people are, you know, getting up every morning and trying to solve these problems on a day-to-day basis. So I think it could be very interesting to do that type of research.
Thank you, Leo. Fletcher?
There are large research gaps in terms of comparing the efficacy of faith-based, multi-faith climate and environmental activism with the efficacy of work done by secular partners. So I think that there's an important body of work that should be done there. There's a similar research gap. I mean, we did some very basic research several years ago about approaches to climate and environmental education by religious educators as compared to best practices that have been established within the field, the professional field of environmental education. And then the third piece is another area which Leo talked about most is there's a growing amount of work by faith groups trying to grapple with how to interact with the commercial sector, particularly in the renewable energy area. And again, there's very little research out there that's probed that, that's identified needs for development for technical assistance to help religious institutions climb up the learning curve. So there are a lot of gaps. I think what we see is a lot of religious institutions trying to do this without adequate knowledge of best practices in the field in the secular world, and that's a real hurdle that I think slows down the development of religious engagement on these issues.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think that we'll talk a little bit more perhaps about, again, those interactions between the faith worlds and perhaps scientific and secular worlds as well. I have a question. But first of all, actually, let's just go to Iyad to answer the same question about the research and evidence gaps, please.
Okay, I was unable to unmute. Well, in fact, I believe that there is a lot of evidence out there. But the problem is, how do we produce and how do we advocate those evidences that are available? What I see is actually competition and not complementary action by faith-based organizations. To tell you the truth, I have been doing my own search on who's doing what, and I have seen a lot of organizations that are interfaith organizations, not necessarily faith-specific organizations, doing the same work. But this is not wrong at all. But we do need to have one sort of mechanism that we all compile. The evidence that I have gathered from all organizations is available on the websites of those organizations. But we do need to see a space where all of these evidences are gathered, collected, and advocated all together, so people would know of the activities, the actions that have been or are being taken by such organizations. So the evidence is there, but we do need to be clever and innovative in the ways we utilize them and make them available.
Thank you very much. And this is something that is a key concern across all of the religion and development research, that sometimes it's not about new research, it's about the communication of that research that exists already. Obviously, we'd be very keen to be able to act as a little bit of that gathering space, not least our very small initial work now in this webinar series and the page that we have online of different resources that we have found from our various members that they have published already. So there is a growing element of being able to communicate what's out there, what research reports and other documents exist, and that's on the climate part of the JLI website, but we would be very keen to help continue that as well. So now we have another question from Herbert James, about the theological and religious belief background of the different organizations. Her question is, what active work are any of you doing or know of in terms of influencing of theological narratives in educational institutions and everyday places of worship on the issue of environmental sustainability? Let's go in a little bit of a different order this time. So actually, perhaps Fletcher, could we go to you first?
Yep, it's something we work on consistently. I can share a link to some research that we did with Climate Outreach in the UK that looked at through some professional and really well done communications research methodologies, what narratives work in the theological area through the Green Seminary initiative. We're working with seminary faculty who are training religious leaders and religious educators about how to think and talk about these issues. I think that, so there's quite a lot of work that's going on. What I would say, what we have found, which is interesting, is that there is a divergence in some cases between the formal theological narratives that are produced by brilliant theologians and religious institutions and the fundamental themes that everyday people of faith and spirit articulate. And that's an important thing, I think, for religious professionals to wrestle with. There's a danger of some eco-theologies becoming too esoteric to be really helpful on a grassroots level. And there is, you know, the research that we did with Climate Outreach showed that there are some extremely rich narratives that emerge when one listens to people in the mosque, in the temple, in the pews, because they have deep intuitions about this. So I would encourage us to think about this not only as sort of quote unquote bringing theology to people, but listening to people about their deep experience and their deep insights about this, because they have them.
Thank you. Over to Leo, please.
Yes, thank you. No, so first of all, I'll just very quickly say that we organize conferences as well for theological students and for faculty with GreenFaith, with Fletcher's wonderful organization. And we have a couple coming up very, very soon, one in Jerusalem, one in Los Angeles in November, where we bring together theologians, the trainers of future clergy, effectively. So by bringing the sustainability issues into the curriculum, we hope that the clergy will go out in this generation, the next generation, much better prepared to talk about this particular topic. That's as far as academia. As far as everyday places of worship, I'm proud to say we're working on an ecological Bible commentary. We started with the Old Testament, and we've identified about a few hundred verses which have an ecological sort of a message. And we're bringing contemporary scientific evidence alongside the verse to show that how the topic plays out in the modern world. So it effectively brings the religious person in the pew straight into the sustainability dimension. And we're raising money for that project at the moment, and we're looking to bring out a Jewish version, a Christian version, maybe other religions will be interested as well.
Thank you.
Right, so I will bring up two practical examples, and I think this is a very important question. We know education is the key for changing the behavior of the people. So two practical examples from UN Environment. We have what we call GUPIS, which is the Global Universities Partnership for Environmental Sustainability. And we are working with more than 500 actually universities at the global level in introducing environmental sustainability in the curricula of these universities. But from a faith perspective, we know that more than 50% of the educational institutions are actually owned by faith-based organizations. So we're trying to introduce religious teachings and the relationship between environment and faith into this global partnership. Another practical example, in the year 2000, UN Environment published a book that is called Earth and Faith, a practical guidelines for action. And in the year 2000, we didn't have the Paris Agreement, we didn't have all the scientific knowledge that we currently have, we didn't have the challenge that we are currently having. So we have decided to republish this book, but of course, with the only other things that have happened in the past 19 or 20 years. So introducing the new concepts, the new scientific evidence, and so on. And we are going to publish a textbook that can be used in schools and universities, and we will call it Faith for Earth, Reflections for Actions. So these two practical examples are being handled by UN Environment, and hopefully they will contribute to improving the relationship between educational institutions and the theological understanding and narrative, providing them with the scientific evidence.
Thank you. So we're now at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap up. There are lots of questions that we could delve into a little bit more, but just a reminder that this is just the second in a series of 4 webinars that we're going to have. So I do encourage you to register for our next webinar. We'll have one on the 18th of June, and then one also the penultimate week of July. So there you have the dates now up on the screen, and you can find our resources and our growing list of resources at the link there. So I really encourage you, if you just have a few minutes now, to add any resources that you may want to add. As we start to grow, as suggested in this webinar, a place where we can understand what research and evidence exists already, and therefore be able to really conclusively pinpoint what research and evidence is needed in the future on this topic of interfaith initiatives in climate, but also more generally from different some specific faith traditions and what the faith-based organizations are doing. So again, thank you very much for joining, everyone. Recording of this will be available on our website shortly, and will also be emailed out to you in case you want to share with other colleagues or listen again. Yes, thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.